What's going on, everybody? So in today's episode, this is going to be geared towards more the new photographers, okay? You went out, you bought yourself a brand new camera. You've been in auto mode this whole time. Well, now you feel like you're ready to start stepping out of your comfort zone and start getting into more of the manual settings of your camera. So in this episode, I'm going to teach you what those manual settings are and how they work. So stay tuned. Alright guys, so let's talk about manual modes or shooting selection modes. Okay? All but the most basic budget compact cameras have shooting selection modes, usually indicated by a dial on the top or on the back of the camera. So these modes might look a little different camera to camera. Alright, some are indicated by pictures, some are indicated by letters. It really is depending on what type of camera you have. So I don't want to talk too much today about the automatic settings, okay? I don't want to talk about the landscape mode or the portrait mode, okay? Because those are still automatic settings. It sets your camera to a certain setting to get the best image possible. It's not always a bad thing, and depending on the situation, it might be a good thing to use. If you've got the time though, and you want to learn what your camera can do, it's time to step it up to the big four, okay? The big four are, now this is varying from camera to camera, and some depict them in different ways, but for the most part, they're all the same. You got manual mode, you've got shutter speed, you've got aperture, and you've got program. So let's talk about manual mode first. This is the selection that's going to give you the most freedom when it comes to your camera. Okay? You can control the shutter speed, you can control the aperture, you can control the ISO. Those are big threes when it comes to producing an image. Okay? It's going to determine how that image looks and the feel of that image. So the next setting we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Okay, that's usually indicated by an S, or I think on Canon it's represented by TV. Okay, now what shutter speed mode is it gives your camera a little bit more control. All right, but it gives you the control over the shutter speed. So let's say you're in a hurry, you really don't have a whole lot of time. You're shooting sports. Okay, you're shooting a race. Now, you don't have a whole lot of time between these actions to mess with all three settings. So now what the camera does is it gives you the free range of shutter speed. So if you want to show motion blur or you want to freeze an image, but you don't want to worry about the aperture, you don't want to worry so much about the ISO, you switch it to shutter speed mode. Now switching to that, you can adjust the shutter speed, and as you adjust the shutter speed, the camera calculates what your shutter speed is and gives you the appropriate ISO and aperture it thinks best to capture that image. Okay, so the slower the ISO, or excuse me, the slower the shutter speed, the faster the shutter speed, the camera is going to adjust those other two for you. Okay, so let's talk about program mode. And I kind of left this one for last because it can be a little confusing, especially for newer users. Now with program mode, the camera takes more of the control. It looks at an image and says, okay, I think these settings will be the best for this. I think this is what you're trying to capture. Now, it can be a little confusing because to me that sounds like automatic mode. It sees what it sees, it chooses a setting, and that's it. Well, in program mode, you still have the option to change some of those settings, and the camera will recalibrate to those, giving you more freedom to, instead of having to choose the settings, the camera does it, and it gives you the option to change the focus or the composition. So that's why it can be a little confusing. I would use this mode very sparingly. I don't use it so much myself because, like I said, it can be a little confusing. I myself like having control over my images, and I want to be able to choose the aperture or the shutter speed or the ISO without the camera trying to make its own guesses as to what I want it to have happen to it. Okay, so now that we've talked about what those selections are, let's go into a little bit more detail as to what shutter speed, aperture, and even your ISO are, okay? Because these are the things that determine the kind of picture you're gonna take and how well it's exposed or underexposed or how sharp or how blurry even this image is gonna be. So let's talk a little bit about shutter speed. Okay, shutter speed plays a really big part in photography. Okay, it determines what type of image you're going to get and how clear that image is going to be. So shutter speed is the curtain that goes between the sensor of your camera. All right, your shutter speed determines how fast that curtain opens and closes to expose the image. Now, what you might notice is there's different settings for your shutter speed and how long it takes for that shutter speed to operate. So for most cameras, most DSLRs, most cameras that have that selection speed, okay, you can set it from anywhere from 30 seconds or even bulb mode, which bulb mode is where you push the button, and for as long as you have the button pushed, that camera's curtain is open, exposing the image. Okay, we'll go into exposure a little bit more later on, but for the most part, exposure is how long that sensor is exposed to light. So the longer it's exposed to light, the more light is on that image. Now, if you're in a darker atmosphere, that could help brighten up the scene a little bit, but if you're in a bright atmosphere and that's open for too long, you could end up with a washed out picture or an overexposed picture. So as I mentioned, you can have your camera open from as long as bulb or 30 seconds all the way up to 1/8,000th of a second. Now, 1/8,000th of a second is really fast. And usually when you use those high of shutter speeds, you're trying to freeze an image. Okay, if you've got a runner, you're trying to catch him in mid-run, no blur, you just want to freeze that image. You'd use a faster shutter speed. Now, if you wanted to, let's say, capture a waterfall, but you don't want to freeze the water, you want to show motion in the water, because when you look at a waterfall, you want to feel that image. You want to see that water moving. Well, you can't do that with a faster shutter speed, so you have to slow that shutter speed down. Now, there's some other variables that go into that, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But the slower you make your shutter, the more motion is going to be introduced into the picture. Now, when I say more motion into the picture, that also plays another part. So in photography, you want to try and capture the sharpest image possible. You don't want to have a whole lot of motion in the picture. So shutter speed is going to play a pretty crucial part in how sharp your images are. Now, if you have if it's a really bright day out and you have a really slow shutter speed and you're hand holding your camera and you're taking pictures, you're trying to capture all of these amazing views, but you're not using a tripod, well, if you've got too slow of a shutter speed and your hand, like most people's hands do, they shake. Well, you're going to get some shaky images. You're going to see that it may look to the naked eye that this image is pretty sharp, but if you zoom in a little bit, you might see that stuff is moved a little bit. The trees aren't as sharp, the mountain's a little blurry, or even your subjects could be a little blurry. So you always have to make sure that whatever you're trying to capture, you either A, need a tripod to keep the camera still enough to capture that image, or you need to boost your shutter speed up in order to freeze that image. Now, a rule of thumb for shutter speed is if you're hand holding the camera, you try not to go under 1/60th of a second. Okay, there's math involved in that, and I'll be honest, I'm not a huge math guy, but there's math involved in it to where at that shutter speed, you should be able to, at a normal, pace, you're not running, you're not moving, but at just holding your camera, you should be able to take a pretty sharp image at 1/60th of a second. Now, that doesn't mean you won't have camera shake, so you have to do your best you can to kind of, suck your arms in a little bit and hold that camera as still as possible. So going into a little bit more of the shutter speed and how long the shutter or the curtain is being operated. As you can see from this picture, in this picture you see there's motion blur, there's movement in the picture. And sometimes that's what the photographer wants. He wants to be able to show that this object is moving. Now, if you look at this image, you can see that the picture is frozen in time. They stop that action. So they have a faster shutter speed to freeze that image. So let's talk about aperture. Aperture actually plays a really big part in photography in how your images look or how your images are perceived. Okay, this gives you the option to show what you want the viewer to focus on. Now, if you look at this image here, this whole image shows everything. The foreground, the background, the middle ground, everything is in focus and everything you can see. Okay? Now, if you look at this image, now in this image, there's a subject that's in focus, and everything behind that subject is blurry. So how that is happening is the aperture inside your camera. If you look at this image, your aperture has rings that open and close. Now, as they open and close, they're allowing more light or less light to enter the camera. And that plays a big part on how well your camera is exposing an image as well. So shutter speed and aperture play a crucial part in the exposure of your image. Now, as you can see from this, as the aperture ring opens, it's allowing more light to come into the camera. But it also creates blur. Now, if you're taking a portrait of somebody and you don't want the background in focus for whatever reason, you don't like the background, and you want the main focus of your image to be this person, okay? You would open up the aperture, allow the camera to focus on your subject, and when you take the image, you should notice that there's a blurry background. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is the blurrier the background, the more the aperture is open. Now, some cameras have really low f-stops, as low as 1.2, 1.4, 1.8. These are going to give you your best blurry backgrounds. Now, it's not to say that you can't get a blurry background with, let's say, an f.4, or excuse me, an f4. Okay? You can get a blurry image, but it might not be as blurry. And where these lenses come in, these types of lenses, these are more like your portrait lenses, your fixed aperture lenses. So they only do one focal length. So now, if you look at this image, you'll see that the iris of the lens is stopping down. So it's allowing less light to come in, which allows the image to be more in focus. It's focusing more on everything as opposed to blurring things out. Now think about your eyeball. In a dark situation, your iris of your eye opens up to allow more light in, but it can also, on a bright sunny day, make the image blurry. Now think about on a bright sunny day, if you're outside, your eyes stopped down, allowing less light to come in, but allowing you to focus. This is what happens when your camera, the iris in it, is focusing. So the best way to think about aperture is to think of it as your eyeball, okay? Or the iris in your eye. Now, when you're in a bright situation, a bright sunny day, okay, you don't want your eye to be fully blown out, fully open, because you're letting too much light in and everything just, it just doesn't work. Everything's washed out, you get a headache. So what your eye does is it compensates for that. It closes down the iris, allowing less light in for you to be able to focus on what's in front of you. Now, take that same situation and now you're, let's say, in a cave, okay, someplace dark, a dark room. What your eye does is it compensates for that. Instead of keeping your eye closed, it now opens up the iris in your eye, allowing more light to come in. Because you can't see if your eyes close down all the way, but it needs to open it up to allow more light to come in. So to kind of wrap up aperture, the more open your aperture, the more light you're letting in, the blurrier the background. The further you stop down the aperture, the less light you're letting in, and more of the image you're allowing to be seen. Okay, so let's talk about ISO. ISO is the last setting in the three. Now, the first one we talked about was shutter speed. The second was aperture. The last is ISO. These three settings together help you generate an image, okay? Now, ISO can be a little difficult to explain and it might be a little confusing, especially to newer photographers. So, I'm going to do the best that I can to try and explain this to you. ISO is a setting that helps the camera compensate for either too much light or too little light. Your settings as far as your aperture and your shutter speed can only do so much unless you adjust the ISO. So let's say, for an example, I want to get a picture of the Milky Way. Well, you have to be in a really dark setting with barely any light. Otherwise, the image can get washed out or not look right. So you want to go to a very, very dark place. Well, in a very dark place, you don't have light. So I think to myself, okay, well, I need more light. I need to open up my aperture more. That helps, okay? I also need to stop down my shutter speed. So I go all the way down to 30 seconds, okay? So with those two, you would think, okay, I have a bigger opening for light. My shutter speed stays open longer, so it'll expose more. In theory, yes, you're correct. Your image would produce more light than it normally would with higher settings. But you need that third thing, ISO, to help introduce more light that isn't there, to help compensate for that lack of light. So in that dark atmosphere, I take that picture without adjusting the ISO. The ISO is at 100. Because the other thing that ISO introduces is what's called noise or grain into an image. The higher the ISO, as you can see from this image here, the grainier the film looks, or the image looks. The lower the ISO, the less noise that's introduced. Because ISO is a mechanical thing. It's not a natural thing. You have to introduce this light in order to expose your picture properly. So back to our scene. I need more light. Well, I don't have more light available, so I have to account for that. So I'll bump my ISO up to, let's say, 4,000. Okay? I take the same image at the same settings. Wow, I can see more of the setting. Okay, I can see more of the stars. I can see the Milky Way better. It's consider it ISO like false light. Okay? That's the best way to explain ISO without confusing you too much. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I love making these videos for you guys, and my aim is to help you guys become better photographers. I wanted to explain a little bit more about the settings on the camera. Hopefully it made it a little less scary for you guys. Hopefully you understand a little bit more about what ISO is, what shutter speed is, and aperture, and how these three things affect your images. So hopefully now, after all of this, you guys can turn it from that little green automatic mode to manual or aperture or shutter speed. You can give those more of a chance. I know in the beginning it was frustrating. You would select those not knowing what they did or what they meant. You didn't know what you were doing. And maybe you even put your camera away because you were so frustrated with how your images were turning out. Then you found this video, I explained it a little bit more, and hopefully you pick that camera back up and you go back out there and you start taking more pictures. I appreciate the support, guys. I really enjoy the comments that you guys leave for me, so please don't stop that. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys on the next one. Take care.